Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Living in the Afterlife. The socio-biological logic of individualism, the new provincialism. Nearly the entire world has been duped by the prodigiously successful obfuscation of the Norman-Saxon origins of the English Civil War, 1642-1651. The political requirements of civil peace have also made this a triumph of English self-deception. Yet modernity cannot be understood with a fully scientific socio-biological analysis of this event, which could rightly be called a political birthing of the modern world. Amidst the successful political smokescreens stands the great defining invention of modernity, the individual. Modern Anglo-American individualism seals off the medieval genealogical tracks to the Norman-Saxon conflict by making that conflict invisible on the basis on its own individualistic premises. Virtually the entire world has been duped by this phenomenon because they have failed to that the individual premise itself traces its own hereditary descent to this first great modernistic outbreak of the Norman-Saxon conflict in 1642. The genealogy of modern individualism can be traced to Thomas Hobbes and the publication of his greatest work of political philosophy, Leviathan, in 1651. This was the same year that the English Civil War came to an end. Leviathan was a radical new program for political peace to solve the problem of civil war. Hobbes had a serious social problem to solve. The people were too altruistic. The problem was that Anglo-Saxons were willing to risk violent death to war against Norman heirs, and vice versa. As W. D. Hamilton's theory of kin selection predicts, there was a correlation between kinship and altruism through a general correlation between the Anglo-Saxon-based House of Commons and the Norman-based Royalists. Since altruistic behavior towards close relatives can help to perpetuate the altruist's own genes, such behavior can be genetically adaptive. The inverse relationship of genetic adaptation and extreme individual rationalism, then, is not accidental. Hobbes is the most relevant original thinker for understanding this inverse relationship, for he was the first thorough and systematic thinker of the modern political premise of the individual. The Hobbesian plan of peace works by systematically inhibiting the altruistic behavior that humans evolved through genetic adaptation. This underlying political program, though moderated in its liberal democratic form, leads to the systemic inhibition of many of the most overt social forms of genetically adaptive behaviors. Hobbes was preoccupied with one extreme problem in the form of civil war, that he was relatively unconcerned with the possibility that individualism, self-interest, taken to its logical extreme, makes devoting resources to another individual, i.e. one's child, irrational. In its original context, individualism provided a coherent perspective from which to criticize the Norman-Saxon interpretation of the English Civil War as irrational. The Norman-Saxon conflict thus gave birth to the theoretical tools by which the individual should not see the Norman-Saxon conflict as such. Its success has provided the liberal democratic heirs of Hobbes and Locke with the practical tools to avoid all kinds of ethnically or racially based conflicts by making them irrational. England's method of sidestepping the race issue of the English Civil War through individualism became the hereditary basis for the American method of achieving ethnic racial civil peace. Here we can see a decisive political reason why an honest confrontation with the entire Norman-Saxon conflict has been squashed. However, the stakes of ignorance have increased, for failure to grasp its significance is directly responsible for the failure to grasp the evolutionarily suicidal logic of individualism that is being realized in both the genetic decline of the West and the displacement of biological humans by machines. The basic theoretical problem with the Hobbesian view becomes clear when one asks, where do these individuals come from? Over 2 centuries after Leviathan, Darwin provided an answer that shattered the shallow foundations of Hobbes' system. From an unadulterated materialistic view of the world, there is no necessary reason to presume that the world must be divided up into individuals over any other perceptual or conceptual scheme. This is what makes the particular perceptions of individuals underlying Hobbesian materialism interesting. or rather, conspicuous, in light of Darwin and subsequent sociobiological discoveries. The English-speaking world has not been keen in clarifying the insurmountable differences between Hobbes and Darwin. Whereas the theoretical innovation of Hobbes was the discovery of the lack of kinship relationships between individuals, the theoretical innovation of Darwin was the discovery of extensive kinship relationships between individual organisms, from man to moth to mold. Whereas Hobbes implicitly carried the eternalist assumption of the isolated, unconnected distinctiveness of the human species to isolated, unconnected individuals, Darwin discovered that all life is evolutionarily related. Hobbes took his theoretical orientation from English politics, while Darwin took his theoretical orientation from the study of the non-human animal world. To gauge the impact of individualism as a basis for modern political philosophy, consider an early draft of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable. 1286. Equal individualism is built upon creationist assumption that God created something from nothing in his own singular image. The equal and independent individual was designed to counter inequality and dependence upon special connections to the conquest class. Dependence, said James Wilson in 1774, was very little else but an obligation to conform to the will of that superior person, upon which the inferior depends. 1287. The scope of Jefferson's individualistic Weltanschauung, however, extended far beyond the human. Nature has, in truth, produced units only through all her works. Classes, orders, genera, species, are not of her work. Her creation is of individuals. No two animals are exactly alike. No two plants, we fix arbitrarily on such characteristic resemblances and differences. 1288. There was, for example, no natural lower class of Saxons. While a pre-sociobiological science could not explain class hostility rationally, individualism provided a sound vantage point from which the revolutionaries could rationalize their situation. In general, there appears to be no answer to the question of what is fundamentally rational. However, the premise of a kin-selective view of genetic interest tends to lead to a trajectory opposite of the premise of strict individual interest. While both individualism and racism are equally irrational in that they both have a basis in unconscious, instinctive desires for forms of self-preservation that precedes conscious deliberation, reflection upon both reveals that the two views are not equivalent. Whereas individualism was built on a pre-Darwinian humanistic provincialism, sociobiology views humans as one branch of a multifarious tree of life. While sociobiology can encompass and explain individualistic theories of human behavior in the tradition of Hobbes, the reverse is not true. Only an understanding of post-biological evolution distinct from biological evolution, yet grounded in biological evolution, can make sense of the new path that Hobbes helped forge. Individualism, translated into biological terms, means that the end purpose of billions of years of evolution is, you. As if born yesterday, liberalism self-centrism became the new ethnocentrism. Just as the tribe is superior in provincialism to the nation-state, and the family superior in provincialism to the tribe, the individual is superior to all in the provincial scope of its necessary concern. Since liberalism trades one kind of provincialism for another, its underlying individualism calls for a new universal provincialism. While a common liberal theme is the artificiality of ethnic, national, class or other social borders, liberals do not want borders to end in themselves, only to rearrange them. Liberals disagree with conservatives only as to which borders should be increased. Stronger borders, it is assumed, should be put around the bodies of the individual on one hand, and those who are found to be ethically beyond the pale of humanity, on the other. To put an end to all borders would be to put an end to all moral borders, all legal borders, and especially the borders defined as human rights. Anglo-Saxon individualism originated by creating these new lines of defensive borders after they lost control of the external socio-biological borders through the Norman conquest. Chapter break. The child tyrant. Back to main text. Richard Dawkins. The selfish gene clarified. A transfigurational insight. A gene's eye view of evolution is not equivalent to the view of an individual organism. 1289. The selfish gene, he explained, is the correct emphasis, for it makes the contrast with the selfish organism, say, or the selfish species. 1290. The gene's eye view, as a clarification of Darwinian theory, constituted a scientific discovery unto itself. The implications of this classic book can clarify a basic theoretical incompatibility between the individualistic innovations of Hobbes and the hereditarian innovations of Darwin. If human individuals are machines created by our genes, then the individual can be viewed as merely a means to the end of its genes. An individual organism, from the view of the selfish gene, is only a technological means of propagating genes into the next generation. From an evolutionary perspective, modern individualism turns the logic of the selfish gene upside down. To value individuals as ends in themselves, as opposed to means of selfish genes, is like throwing a monkey wrench into the ancient machinery created by our genes. Modern individualism is so effective at deracinating the genetic ties between people because it subverts the ancient tyranny of the selfish gene. Consider humans' emotions, especially the desire for sex, from the perspective of the selfish gene. From an evolutionary point of view, the human instinct of sexual desire is a genetic adaptation. Romantic love and sexual instinct evolved as a mechanism for propagating genes into the next generation. From the perspective of modern individualism, however, the desire for sex becomes unhinged from its ancient role as a mechanism of gene propagation and becomes as end in itself. Just as the modern ethic treats individuals as ends in themselves, the instincts and emotions of individuals, by implication, also become valued as ends in themselves. Technologies such as the condom allow individuals to satisfy such sexual instincts and emotions as ends in themselves, even if such behavior is positively deleterious to original adaptive function of sexual desire. The condom can be viewed as a symbol of the conflict between the selfish individual and the selfish gene. The condom thwarts the selfish genes by treating the instinctive means of gene propagation as ends mastered by the individual. If the condom fails to thwart the selfish genes, then abortion is the next technology available to individuals. The abortion issue helps clarify just how questionable the modern premise of the individual is when viewed in light of biological evolution. The controversy over the demarcation point between life and non-life illustrates the essential arbitrariness of this abstraction of the individual when applied to biological realities. The attempt to make biological sense of the individual in this case clarifies how biology exposes the limits of the autonomy of this modern concept. The moment of the insemination of an egg, the defining moment of gene propagation, is exactly when the subordination of the individual organism to its genes is most obvious. Yet the abortion controversy over exactly when an individual human life can be considered equal and independent continues beyond the pregnancy stage. The question of whether an embryo has rights leads to the question of whether a child has rights. In the United States, a human becomes most fully independent and equal in a legal sense at the age of 18. The continuum between conception and pregnancy, where an arbitrary demarcation determines when a fetus can be aborted, then, could really be extended up to the age of 18. The dependency of a child on its parents, after all, is only a continuation of that fetal dependency. If birth was the authentic time of independence, we could tell an infant at that moment, "You re on your own, kid." Since equal independence is the grounds of normative rights, one could argue that abortion should be permitted for children until the age of 18. At the moment of conception, when the genes have most control, so to speak, the individual has the least control. The early development period, when the logic of the genes rule, the logic of individualism makes the least sense. In the case of abortion, a woman's right to control her own individual body conflicts directly with the rights of the genes, Both the father's genetic contribution to half of the fetus's genes and the right of the fetus's genes to freedom of expression, so to speak. The continuum between pregnancy and childhood, and its conflict with the rights of the mother as an individual, is verified by the duty to raise the child. There is an inherent conflict between the right to total individual freedom and duty to child raising. Any parent who serves the needs of a child lives a life of servitude to that child, and unfreedom that was traditional bolstered by social norms. The child, in this sense, is as tyrannical in its demands for subordination as any king. The younger the child, the greater the self-sacrifice demanded, and the greater the injustice to the parent. If one can accept this injustice to one's individual self as an individual, then one can find the kernel of the dutiful acceptance of every injustice, every father, every patriarch, and every king in the name of perpetuating humankind. The seed of patriarchy was implanted with the father's sperm. That the relationship between mother and child cannot be fully equal is simply another way of admitting that a child needs to be raised in order to become an equal. If a man or woman wishes to maintain their free individuality, then why not cultivate new friendships instead of sacrificing oneself to a child? It would be more sensible to develop other human relationships than make oneself a slave to the needs and wants of a child. Whereas a friendship can be one of equals, a child is a dependent, not an equal. The relationship is degrading in at least two senses. It is degrading in that the woman, in most cases, is bound in servitude to a child who cannot be considered a full equal. This, after all, is why childbearing was traditionally viewed as a role suitable for women who themselves are socially inferior to their husbands. Modernistic, liberated women also consider it degrading to be constrained to their biological role as baby-making machines. They have apparently found a more noble pursuit in the role of money-making machine. Only in this way can they prove that they are the equals to their husbands in placing rights to themselves over duties to others. This is simply a continuation of the logic of feminism through individuation. Just as a feminism liberated women from the slavery-like institution of marriage represented by the tradition patriarchal male head of the family, liberation from the tyranny of the child is the next to follow. Just as liberation from patriarchy required the ability to see through romanticizations of the oppressions of the traditional family, liberation from romanticization of self-sacrifice to an utterly egoistic infant and child follows logically. The child is final tyrant to be overthrown before individuals can truly be free as individuals. If Westerners lived up to the claims of civilization and tamed their instincts and emotions enough to act upon rational, consistent individualism, and not discriminate on the basis of kinship relations, nepotism, or sentimentalism, then what does the child become? The child becomes an individual, simply another individual. Childbearing and raising children by either sex is a barbaric legacy of the old patriarchal order in the sense that instinct and emotion remains fundamentally uncivilized in that reason has not been fully applied to life. For what rational reason would one have children? The means of childbearing and child raising have been civilized, but what of this end? The instinctive desire to have children is the logic of the selfish gene, not the logic of the selfish individual or rational individual self-preservation. If an individual is truly free to choose his or her way of life, why would one volunteer for a life of servitude to a child tyrant? If all individuals are equal, then why opt for this manifest inequality? For those who opt for full freedom and equality, the option to have kids is neither superior nor inferior to options like surfing or mountain climbing. Who is to say that childbearing is more important than expanding your shoe collection? Feel something missing? Get a dog or a cat. Infertility may bring new life, at least, to the pet industry. If the liberal egalitarian project succeeded in producing a truly individualistic rationalism, no one would have children. The progress of universal individualism would ultimately lead to the end of the biological human race. In this way, the death spiral logic of individualism nicely parallels the death spiral logic of egalitarianism. Yet even liberalism cannot completely subvert human instinct and the remains of family-friendly social norms. Childbearing is an irrationality that survives despite individualistic reasoning, not because of it. It is the sheer strength of instinct over reason that engenders the fecundity that remains. What really happens in the Western countries that adopt feminism and individualism is not the completed end of the human race, but rather, the relative demographic decline of the native populations of liberal democracies. The individual irrationality of the self-sacrificial parent-to-child relationship helps produces genetically suicidal birth rates. What really happens, in other words, is evolution, differential reproductive success of competing genes from one generation to the next. The condom, once again, symbolizes the difference between individual selfishness and genetic selfishness. The survivors of abortion, birth control, feminism, and individualism in succeeding generations are the ones who will bear the consequences of freedom that their ancestral populations enjoyed. In the Anglo-American world, this great unraveling of kinship relations begins with the socio-biological reduction achieved by the Norman conquest of 1066. The success of the conquest was the successful defeat of the Anglo-Saxon nation and the successful annihilation of their native aristocracy. The success of this defeat meant that even the success of the nationalist counter-conquest, i.e. democratic revolution, was a reduced victory. The new equal individualism that formalized Anglo-Saxon adaptation to ethnic defeat led to the very opposite of ethnic victory. The individualistic rationalism that in its original context of conquest could be a means of ethnocentrism became a full end in itself, weakening its original ethnocentric end. The right to individual selfishness was originally a scheme to instate the illegitimacy of duty and sacrifice to the rulers from a lack of kinship connection to the usurping conquerors. Individualism can be genetically adaptive when individuals are not a means of their own genes, but rather, slaves to the more distant genetic ends of others. When universalized, however, rights are a veto power over the claims of all kinship relationships and a license for genetic suicide. The kinship discontinuity between the Norman conquerors and the conquered Anglo-Saxon is the original fracture from which the entire web of kinship bonds broke down and unraveled in what is known as modernity. The Norman conquest is the elemental source of the American trajectory from kin to kith. When universalized, this original kinship discontinuity of the past implicated a kinship discontinuity for the future. The relationship between a parent and its biological child is a kinship relationship that differs only in degree from relationships of extended family, ethnicity, and race. If one does not prefer one's racial or ethnic kin, then why should one prefer one's family kin? If kinship relationships are a matter of total indifference, then why should one prefer to have a family at all? If one does not give special favor to one's child on the grounds of kinship, then there is no reason to prefer the option to have a child to making a new friend. Whereas a new friendship can be one of peers with mutual benefits, a new child is a dependent non-peer that subtracts from individual rationality and individual freedom. In disciplined assessment of profits and losses in the classic bourgeois manner, the option of having children ceases to add up. If racism has its fundamental origin showing positive, favoritistic attitudes and behaviors towards those of relative genetic kinship similarity, and negative, excluding, and hostile behaviors towards genetic aliens, then childbearing could be seen as a fundamental source of promoting kinism or racism. To raise a biological child, after all, is to perpetuate favoritism based on kinship relationship. If nepotism is considered a social problem to eliminate it, then not having children might be considered one way of avoiding the temptation and eliminate the problem at its root. It does not quite work out like this, however. While having biological children may perpetuate the underlying kinship principles of nepotism and racism, having no children leaves Earth populated by those who do preserve some form of these values. That, after all, is evolution. In consequence, the decline of racist attitudes and decline in fertility in the more developed countries is not an accidental correlation. Those who do rear children are probably more likely to adopt non-biological children, and this reflects immigration policies that are, in themselves, a form of political adoption. If extended kinship relations are universally devalued in favor of individualism, this implies the devaluation, not only of one's ancestors, but the devaluation of one's successors. The result is the genetic decline of liberal democratic countries. The Nazi attempt to avert the decline of the West, by contrast, was built on the valuation of both progenitors and successors over the biological short-sightedness of individualism. While the Nazis were socially invested in one another's genetic children, the child in the West is simply another individual. While the universal independence of every human being destroys any genetic basis for social relations, the totality of the Nazi uberorganism united their nation through collective responsibility for a collective past, present and future. The totality of the Nazi regime stems from a grasp of kinship in subjective evolutionary time from all directions. The Nazi socio-biological synthesis could almost be defined as everything that liberal individualism unravels. From the permanent scars of the Norman vivisection of the Saxon nation, laid the severed strings of political kinship unity reflected inversely through the shiny new mirror of progressive modernity. The strings of individualism, once formally unleashed, could not hold together all the rest, and the whole thing came unraveled and undone. The logical product of universalizing this breakdown in kin relations, or pseudo-kin relations, is individualism, emphasize the existing person rather than present, past, or implicitly future kin. While the empiricism of Hobbes can now be viewed as a provincial view of his political present, a means of negating the kinship roots of the English Civil War, Darwin's new horizons towards an evolutionary past also implicate new perspectives on an evolutionary future. While an individual is empirically observable in the present, the individuals that he or she may spawn are not observable in the present. Just as individualism implicitly isolates one from the kinship past as the product of genetically adaptive behavior, individualism isolates one from the future prospects relative to genetically adaptive behavior. Just as the Norman political machine threw a monkey wrench into any comparative Anglo-Saxon sense of kin-selective unity, individual rights only returned the favor by continuing the break of hereditary links. From the view of a kin-selective socio-biological organism, individual rights are like a monkey wrench thrown into the gene machine, a valuation of selfish individuals over selfish genes that subverts any assumption of collective genetic interests. Individual rights subverted the unnatural Norman right of conquest. Instead of individuals existing for the state, the modern state would exist for the sake of individuals. The monkey wrench of individual rights, when thrown into the gears of the old Norman state, shattered the old political machine into its individual gears. This attack on kin-selective socialism is what made the ethnic diversity of America possible. The roots of English-speaking political modernity are directly related to the Norman conquest in that 1066 represented the failure of Anglo-Saxon socio-biological conservation. Conservation is preservation, while political liberalism is based on individual self-conservation, self-preservation. Political conservatism, based on the patriarchal family, is rooted in an ancient evolutionary heritage of genetic self-conservation. Anglo-Saxon liberalism is inseparable by a failure to conserve a socio-biologically preserving political organization. Put another way, the birth of modern individualism was delivered through Anglo-Saxon national death. Welcome to the afterlife. Political conservatism has its origins in gene conservatism. From this standpoint, one can see that Nazism was conservative only in zeroing in the genetic consequences of behavior. The Nazis broke all traditions that conflicted with the conservation of the German race or preferred blood. The deepest Nazi attack was on the traditional values inherited from Christianity, because they intuitively realized Christianity's attack on the Darwinian logic of the genes. The values conveyed by the memes of Christianity work in direct competition with the genes of a Christian. Christian memes posit the notion that each individual life is sacred, and this directly opposes the selfish gene view, in which the individual is only a means for gene propagation. The individual, then, stands at the hinge of a biblical battle between evil gene propagation and good meme propagation. As I have discussed in the seditious genius of the spiritual penis of Jesus, Christian altruism is the opposite of kin-selective altruism, and the most potent Christian memes spread through subversion of kin-selective behaviors. The Anglo-Saxons who became Puritans were vulnerable to Christian meme propagation because the Norman conquest weakened the dynamics of their kin-selective altruism. The kin-selective insanity of the premise of the individual originated with the goodness of Christian altruism. The infinite soul of an individual Christian is the pivotal origin of the modern sense of rightness of individual rights. The genetic decline of the West, the worldwide decline in the frequency of genes of West European populations, is an ultimate consequence of Christianity's subversion of kin-selective altruism and a decisive socio-biological foundation of the modern idea of progress. Kantian ethics posit that individuals should be treated as an end, and never as means. From this Christian-rooted modern valuation, the selfish genes are, by definition, evil because the individual organism amounts to nothing more than a means of the ends of the selfish genes. It should be no surprise then, that Hitler, whose innovations consisted of applying racial biological premises to politics, has become the Western poster boy for evil. Since our genes use human individuals as means, not ends, by modern Western standards, our genes are inherently immoral or evil. As the demographic trends of the advanced liberal democracies demonstrate, Western individualism has made progress in eradicating this evil. The logic of the individual thrives at the expense of the logic of the genes. Throughout most of life's evolutionary history, one could say that the political left was the means of the political right. The individual organism was the means of its genes. The individual was a technology of selfish gene propagation. Ultimately, the progressive left militates against this very general form of slavery, the slavery of individuals to their selfish genes. The left is, to paraphrase Dawkins, a revolt against the tyranny of the selfish gene. In general, leftism is premised on the human ability to outsmart the logic of the genes. The intelligence that evolved as the machinery of selfish genes inflicted a revolution upon its roots. Just as the logic of modern individualism makes childbearing and child-raising irrational, modern individualism makes sacrifices in war and eugenic sacrifices for the race irrational. The individualism that makes the peak biological development of eugenics irrational is only a peak implication of the monkey wrench of individualism and thwarting all genetically adaptive behavior. The Judeo-Christianity modern valuation of the individual reverses the socio-biological logic that culminates in Nazism. This is one pivotal reason why the Nazis attempt to annihilate both Christian morals and its Jewish biological roots, see absolute purity. Yet the Nazis' biologically centric Weltanschauung shut out the possibility that Christian modern values effective end the logic of biological evolution, not for its own sake or solely in the interests of the Jewish race, but as a platform for post-biological evolution. The ethics of Kant, as a distillation of secularized Christian values, discloses the evolutionary structural foundation of this platform. If morality consists of treating individual humans as means, and not ends, then the selfish genes, which effectively use individual humans only as a means of reproducing themselves, are the very definition of evil.